But I give China an 8 or 9. And the reason why I give China an 8 or 9 is because, you know, whenever a new great power emerges, throughout history you see as a great power emerges rising levels of tension and rising danger of conflict. But China is emerging in a massive way without creating any tremors. Now that requires enormous geopolitical dexterity. What you have today in the West is a population that is on top of the mountain but has never struggled to climb the mountain themselves. Mm-hmm. And they assume that their natural place is to be up on the mountain. So they become arrogant, smug, condescending vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And when they watch the rest of the world climbing the mountain, right, they look down and they say, why can't you become democratic overnight? Mm-hmm. What's wrong with you? Excuse me, even the United States, right? When you look at it, you proposed the principle of equality of man in 1776. It took you 100 years to get rid of slavery after that. Mm-hmm. It took you another 150 years to give the vote to the women. It took you 200 years to effectively give the vote to the black people. It took you so long to get to the top of the mountain. And yet, when you expect other societies to change overnight. And this is where the dialogue between the East and the West is going to change. Because clearly now, there is a remarkable degree of resentment in the East towards lectures by Westerners, telling them this is how you should transform your societies. And the attitude of many in Asia is, go fix your own societies first. We are doing a reasonable job. Don't teach us what to do. Look at what you are doing that is wrong in your societies. And so, in the West, which always sees itself as being the solution to a problem, cannot conceive of the possibility that the West may now be part of the problem.
我们刚刚听到的不是今天的评论，这段话出自17年前，2008年5月，新加坡资深外交家马凯硕的一场访谈。17年前，一位来自东方的智者就已经为西方的傲慢与虚伪开出了一剂猛药。可17年过去了，西方不仅没有变得更好，反而让我们更加看清，西方不仅没吃这剂药，反而病得更重了。在接下来的内容中，我们将一同穿越回2008年，去重新审视这场惊人坦率的诊断。你将听到马凯硕如何以一个亚洲视角，系统性的炮轰当时还如日中天的西方世界。他将一针见血地论证曾自诩为解决方案的西方是如何一步步沦为世界问题本身的。他将撕下西方民主的伪善面具，揭露其在全球机构中是如何通过独裁统治来维护自身特权的。他更将无情地戳破美国是如何通过发动战争、滥用酷刑，彻底葬送了自己的道德权威，让全世界看清了他的双重标准。这不是一次简单的历史回顾，这是一次跨越17年的打脸。让我们一起回到过去，看看今天的全球乱局，其根源早已在当年被精准预言。
It's interesting because toward the end of the Cold War, and as Asia began to rise, the idea was, okay, Asia, there were so many different peoples, so many ethnic divisions, so many different countries, that we were entering an era in which war would be constant or intermittent at a minimum in Asia. That didn't happen. Why not?
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because I've noticed, as you know, in what happens in academia is that as a result of textbooks, you get recycled wisdom being sent to the students, you know. And unfortunately, most students in America and Europe keep reading the old stuff that was written about Asia, which says, and I quote this in my first book, Can Asians Think?, that Europe's past is Asia's future, which means that the Europe that used to fight each other for centuries will therefore, this is what Asian powers will do. As they rise and emerge, they will fight each other like the European powers do. And this assumes, of course, that the Asians cannot think, cannot figure out for themselves, hey, what works in the world, indeed. But as I explain in the book, one of the 7 pillars of Western wisdom that the Asians are learning is what is called the culture of peace. And here the biggest tribute I give to the European Union is that the European Union has reached the highest level of human civilization. And by the highest level I mean that in Europe you don't just have 0 wars between any 2 EU member states, you also have 0 prospect of war. And that's an incredible human achievement, you know? And the Asians have studied that and looked at Europe and said, hey, why can't we do it too? Why not learn from Europe? So in Asia, we already achieved 0 wars. Indeed, for the first time in a long time, the guns are silent. There are no more interstate wars anywhere in East Asia. And so you can now proceed to the next level of trying to achieve 0 prospect of war. And from all I see in Asia, this is the trend. This is clearly the dominant trend in Asia.
And is it because of the rise of the middle class as part of this march to modernity that there isn't a constituency for war? And on what circumstances might there be?
I think, well, I give a very simple explanation, you know. I say that what you see in Asia today is that Asia has been overcome by a tidal wave of common sense. And, you know, you have more and more young Asians, you know, who can see what life is like. You mentioned YouTube, you mentioned Google, all that's prevalent in Asia. In fact, the degree of broadband penetration is higher in many Asian countries than in America or Europe. This is something very few Americans know. And so they're connected to the modern world. And if you're connected to the modern world, you really realize the futility of war. And in some ways, you know, the Iraq war, which as you know is very tragic, its biggest contribution may have been to further delegitimize war in the modern world. Because the whole world could see that the richest and the most powerful country in the world couldn't invade and occupy a country of 20 million people, very poor country. It shows how difficult war is today. And so it's clear that, of course, the Asian countries will continue to have defense budgets, will continue to have military expenditures, and that, as you know, is prudent, but they're going to try and avoid war.
You look at China as kind of a model in the way it's formulated a foreign policy that has furthered developments in Asia and furthered the stability of the region. Talk a little about that, and why do you think China was able to seize that course?
Well, you know, I've tried to create a new index of what I call geopolitical competence, and in which I put the EU at a 2. You know, it's the former Soviet Union at a 2. It's from 1 to 10. The former Soviet Union at a 2 because it disappeared. The EU at a 4 because around all its borders it has unsafe borders. The United States I give a 6, but I give China an 8 or 9. And the reason why I give China an 8 or 9 is because, you know, whenever a new great power emerges, throughout history you see as a great power emerges rising levels of tension and rising danger of conflict. But China is emerging in a massive way without creating any tremors. Now that requires enormous geopolitical dexterity. And one of the most brilliant moves that the Chinese government made, because they knew that at some point in time the United States might try to contain China. I mean, you don't have to be a genius to anticipate that. So what did the Chinese do? They launch a preemptive strike. And what is their preemptive strike? They export their peace and prosperity to all their neighbors. And this explains why the fastest growing trade flows in the world are not in Europe, not across the Atlantic, not in North America, not across the Pacific, but between China and its neighbors. And this represents a major geopolitical decision, no? Whether it's between China and Japan, China and India. And I can tell you that one of the most brilliant moves that the Chinese did was to propose a free trade agreement with Southeast Asia. You know, Southeast Asia you might call the soft underbelly of China, right? 500 million people who in the past had been used by the United States to contain China in the Cold War. So what does China do? Propose a free trade agreement. And not only did they propose a free trade agreement, they concluded it in record time. And even before they concluded it, they gave the ASEAN countries of Southeast Asia, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, an early harvest by giving them unilateral concessions into the Chinese market. Now, if only Europe could copy what China did and export its prosperity to Africa, it would make it a much safer world for Europe in the long run. But obviously, what China can do today, Europe still cannot do. It shows how far ahead China is in geopolitical competence.
And there's a learning cycle here that you're describing, which is quite fascinating. Namely, the West had much to teach. Asia learned, and in some respects, the West has ceased to learn, whereas Asia has built on what it learned and is actually, in some cases, navigating a new course.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, you see, the tragedy about the West is that the early generations in the West succeeded because they had open minds and they were willing to learn and experiment and be pragmatic. What you have today in the West is a population that is on top of the mountain but has never struggled to climb the mountain themselves. And they assume that their natural place is to be up on the mountain. So they become arrogant, smug, condescending vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And when they watch the rest of the world climbing the mountain, right, they look down and they say, why can't you become democratic overnight? What's wrong with you? Excuse me, even the United States, right? When you look at it, you proposed the principle of equality of man in 1776. It took you 100 years to get rid of slavery after that. It took you another 150 years to give the vote to the women. It took you 200 years to effectively give the vote to the black people. It took you so long to get to the top of the mountain. And yet, when you expect other societies to change overnight. And this is where the dialogue between the East and the West is going to change. Because clearly now, there is a remarkable degree of resentment in the East towards lectures by Westerners, telling them this is how you should transform your societies. And the attitude of many in Asia is, go fix your own societies first. We are doing a reasonable job. Don't teach us what to do. Look at what you are doing that is wrong in your societies.
There's a story in your book that I found fascinating, which is the difference in the way the American elite prepared for the occupation of Japan in comparison with the lack of preparation for the invasion and then occupation of Iraq. Talk a little about that, and how do you explain the difference?
Well, I think the big difference between the American occupation in 2005 of Japan.
You mean
Iraq? 1945 in Japan and 2003 in Iraq. The big difference is that the occupying powers in Japan knew that they had to understand Japanese culture. I mean, one of the most critical decisions that was made in 1945 was not to put the emperor on trial, but to say, hey, if we want to preserve stability in Japan, and we have to preserve social and political stability in Japan, you have to preserve some critical institutions. So you have to understand Japanese history and culture. Now, the people who went to Iraq were the most incredibly arrogant people. And they thought they didn't have to study Iraqi culture at all. And they made disastrous decisions, this de-Baathification. So you remove the entire middle class, the entire ruling elite, and threw them out. And of course the society falls apart. The glue that holds a society completely fell apart. I make an even more telling comparison between the way the Japanese occupied Singapore in 1942. And even though they were brutal, they made sure that even the British colonial officers who were running Singapore were allowed to stay in their place. I gave the incredible example of the Botanic Gardens in Singapore, which is a world treasure, frankly. And when the Japanese sent a botanist from Tokyo to Singapore, they told the British botanist, please stay. You have to preserve these beautiful gardens. By contrast, the Americans allowed the looting of these incredibly ancient treasures in the Museum of Baghdad. Now that's incredible incompetence, you know. And I'm surprised. What amazes me about all this discourse is that so few minds in America keep asking this fundamental question: why have we become so incompetent? What has gone wrong? And I think a lot of it has to do with ideological arrogance that has grown in the Western mind. And this ideological arrogance has to be removed. Otherwise you'll become a major obstacle to the West understanding the nature of the real world that is emerging.
You talk about that, and let's discuss that now, namely a set of principles. We're not now talking about the pillars that help in the march toward modernity, but we're really talking about the end of the Cold War and a misunderstanding of why we won the Cold War and how we won it, leading to the notion that we can now face the world on the mountain and give it a new set of principles that are defined by the way we see ourselves, and that they should be implemented all over the world. Talk a little about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, as you know, this is not a secret. There was a great mood of Western triumphalism at the end of the Cold War. I saw it in Europe when I went to a meeting of foreign ministers of European Union and ASEAN. The then Belgian foreign minister, Willy Klaas, said, there are only two superpowers left in the world, America and Europe, and we will set the rules for the world. And in America, as you know, there was this incredible celebration of Francis Fukuyama's argument that all societies in the world now must immediately become liberal democratic. I mean, this is a distortion of Francis Fukuyama's argument, but that's what they wanted to believe. And in the process, the West failed to understand why it really succeeded in the battle against the Soviet Union. It succeeded not because of its political system, it succeeded because of its economic system. And the real test of which was more important came at the end of the Cold War, when Russia and China took different roads. Gorbachev, unfortunately, bought the argument, the Western argument, and he said, hey, it's all about politics. So he changed the political system before changing the economic system, and that led to economic chaos in Russia. There was a huge economic implosion. Living standards went down, life expectancy went down, infant mortality rates went up, the various social indicators went negative, and the Russians suffered in the 1990s. And if you want to understand why Russians are so bitter towards the West today, they feel that at a time in the 1990s when they were really suffering, the West kept cheering them, saying, hey, Russia, you're doing a great job, you have democracy, you have democracy. And they were suffering. And that's why they resent these lectures from the West on democracy. By contrast, China took the opposite road. And Deng Xiaoping said, hey, it's not about politics, it's about economics. We must fix our economic system. So by focusing on transforming the economic system, China went through a spectacular growth. So clearly China understood what was a real factor that explained the West's success in the Cold War. It's all about transforming your economic system first before you transform your political system.
You describe how freedom is understood in China, because one of the the mantras of the Bush administration and America in this new phase is must have free and fair elections. There has to be freedom. The march of mankind to freedom. But there are different definitions of freedom, and if we don't understand that's problematic.
Yeah. Well, I think if you look at it from the point of view of the Chinese people, right? If you are living on less than $1 a day and you're struggling to feed your family, it makes no difference if you have any kind of political freedom or the right to vote if you can't feed your family. So from the Chinese people's point of view, when you look back over the last 150 years, they've gone through foreign invasions, the British coming to China saying, please, we want to buy your tea, accept our opium in return. And when the Chinese said no thank you, the British bombarded the Chinese, occupied parts of China, and insisted that the Chinese accept opium. So they've gone through hell over the last 150 years. Now finally, for the first time in almost 2 centuries, the Chinese are experiencing this incredible improvements in their standard of living. And in China, the number of people living on less than $1 a day have fallen from 600 million to 200 million. So 400 million people, larger than the population of America, right, have seen a significant improvement in their lives. And what happens? You get greater freedom. You can finally go out and not face the stress of survival. You have choices to make. You can choose where to work. You can choose to buy television sets. You can choose to travel. And that's a remarkable improvement in your lifestyle. They're experiencing real personal freedom. And the real test of whether or not a society is free or unfree is when its people are allowed to go overseas. Do they come back or do they stay overseas? Right? Obviously, if China was a closed, dark, oppressive society, as soon as the Chinese could leave, they would leave and not come back. But guess what? Each year, over 20 million Chinese tourists travel overseas. And almost all of them come back to China. Why do they do that? Obviously, they have enough freedom to do what they want to do. Clearly, China hasn't achieved the political freedoms that America has, but it took America 200 years to achieve it. And maybe if you give China, maybe not 200 years, 100 years, they may achieve what the Americans did in 200 years. But the other more controversial point that I would like to make here is that the Americans assume that they will always remain defenders of freedom, no matter what. But if you look at what America did after 9/11, you look at the erosion of civil liberties in America, you look at the way the Americans are prepared to accept the Patriot Act, it's clear that when the Americans feel threatened, they too walk away from many of the freedoms that they celebrate. And the most astounding thing, the most shocking thing that America did after 9/11, by the way, was to practice torture. And this has come as a huge shock to the rest of the world. They said, how can this land, the beacon of freedom, the beacon of human rights and so on and so forth, take this major step backwards and begin to practice torture? It's almost as bad as America going back to re-implement slavery again, because it was the move away from slavery. It was the move to delegitimize torture. These were great leaps forward in the battle for human rights. And America, the leading defender of human rights, suddenly began to practice torture. And you can imagine how shocked the rest of the world is. And the rest of the world is saying to America, you no longer have any moral authority to give lectures to anybody on any human rights questions, because you have failed your own test.
You do a very interesting analysis of the way things have turned in the sense of Western hypocrisy, the Western changes in their attitude toward the very global institutions that they created. And I want to explore that now because the sense of that is part of what you call the de-Westernization process, namely as Asia rises and it sees things like the American Record on Torture, there is a delegitimation of the placement on the top of the mountain, to use your metaphor. Now, early in your book, you quote Samuel Huntington, and Samuel Huntington says, the West, in effect, is using international institutions, military power, and economic resources to run the world in a way that will maintain Western predominance, protect Western interests, and promote Western political values. Is that the new change?
Yes, I think as a result of the shift of power to Asia, the West has got to make some major decisions now. It's, in a sense, has got to choose between its narrow short-term interests in protecting its positions of predominance in many global institutions and its longer interests in a stable world order. And the way you create a stable world order is by giving the rising powers a stake, make them responsible stakeholders in the key global institutions. But it is very difficult for anybody who holds a privileged position to give up his or her power. Let me give you some examples, okay? The two most powerful international economic organizations in the world are IMF and the World Bank. And even to today, there's a rule that says that to be the head of the IMF, you have to be a European. To be the head of the World Bank, you must be American. And 3.5 billion Asians don't qualify. And this is amazing. Asia today has the fastest growing economies. Asia has the largest pool of reserves, foreign reserves in the world. Asians have demonstrated that they can do equally well in economic enterprises, but Asians are not qualified to run these two institutions. And by the way, this practice was reaffirmed as recently as 2007, last year, when you had a change of the leadership of both World Bank and the IMF, and they still went back to the old practice. Now, this is an example where you got to discard these anachronistic rules to adjust to the rise of Asia. Another example, the UN Security Council, right? It was a very wise move on the part of the Founding Fathers to create the principle of permanent membership, to ensure that the great powers of the day had a stake in the UN and didn't walk away from it as they did with the League of Nations, right? It's a good principle to give the great powers of the day a stake in the United Nations. But what you have today in the UN Security Council is not the great powers of today, not the great powers of tomorrow, but the great powers of yesterday. Indeed, the only qualification for permanent membership seems to be that you must have won World War II in 1945. And this rule has got to go. I mean, take for example the Europeans celebrating the fact that they're going to have a common European foreign policy in January 2009. They can finally provide Henry Kissinger a telephone number that he can call to find out what the foreign policy of Europe is. Great. Then in this case, have a single European seat in the UN Security Council and no longer have separate seats for UK and France. But neither UK nor France will give up their privileged positions.
You are saying that the real danger here is the failure of the West to adjust to the new political realities that are emerging because of the rise of Asia. And I want to understand, why is that? Is it that people have ideas in their head and they refuse to change? I'm talking about the West now. Is it that the Western intellectuals are not defining this new world and those new ideas are not entering the policy debate? Or is it that Western politicians are worried about the next election?
Well, I think it's a combination of all those factors. And in a sense, this is why I felt a tremendous pressure to write the book at this stage, because we are now entering one of the most plastic moments of world history. We're going to see shifts of power of a scale that has never before been seen in human history. Incredible shifts of power. Now, with so much shifts of power, you have to begin to adjust and accommodate. And this is where the West, which has got used to 2 centuries of domination of world history, has got to make adjustments. And so, in the West, which always sees itself as being the solution to a problem, cannot conceive of the possibility that the West may now be part of the problem and not just part of the solution. And this idea, by the way, is very difficult to implant in Western minds, because even the most sophisticated intellectuals in the West cannot accept this. Let me give you a simple, concrete example. Soon after my book came out, The Economist gave it a review. And I was very pleased that The Economist gave it a whole-page review. But what did they say the book is? They said the book is an anti-Western polemic. Now that's a complete misunderstanding of what the book is all about. Indeed, I keep emphasizing that the new Asians don't want to dominate the West, they want to replicate the West. They want to become equal partners of the West. But it is the West that refuses to accept this equal partnership. It is the West that refuses to give up its privileged positions, whether it's in the IMF or World Bank or UN Security Council and so on and so forth. And so the West is today the biggest threat to the world. Now, for me to even say a simple sentence like the West is the biggest threat to the world today is inconceivable to Western minds. It's absolutely inconceivable. And this is why when I explain in my introduction to this book that this book is a painful book. I don't deny that. In fact, my wife, as you know, advised me not to publish it. She said, you're going to get many of your friends unhappy in the West. I say that's true. But the discomfort you feel on reading my book is the necessary discomfort you have to go through to begin to understand the nature of the new world that is emerging.
我们刚刚重温的是一场跨越了17年的打脸现场。17年的时间像一面放大镜，不仅没有让马凯硕当年的警告过时，反而让我们看得更清楚西方的傲慢与双标是何等的根深蒂固。17年过去了，让我们看看这位东方智者的诊断应验了多少。他当年批判的意识形态傲慢，在今天已经演变成了西方内部愈发严重的社会撕裂和政治闹剧。他当年揭露的西方在全球机构中的独裁特权，在今天正面临着全球南方的集体觉醒和金砖国家的强力挑战，让所谓基于规则的秩序沦为笑柄。他当年痛斥的美国道德权威的丧失，在随后一场又一场的对外干涉和地缘冲突中，被一次又一次的自我确认。历史给了西方17年的时间去反思和纠错，但他交出的答卷却是变本加厉的遏制与打压。这场17年前的对话像一把手术刀，精准地解剖了今日西方所有困境的病根。他也留给我们几个值得深思的问题：第一，当一个文明的精英集体陷入意识形态的傲慢而听不进任何逆耳忠言时，他的衰落是否就是一种历史的必然？第二，我们今天所目睹的全球范围内的种种冲突与乱象，究竟有多少是西方当年种下的因，如今结出的果？以及当17年前的警告已经成为血淋淋的现实，我们是否可以说西方正在为其过去几十年的虚伪、双标与傲慢付出应有的历史代价？我们期待在评论区听到你的想法。如果你认为这期节目对你有价值，请点赞、评论、分享、订阅我们的频道。感谢你的观看。